I do want to correct a mistake. Last time we talked about this Wei Wei Jiu Zhao, which is besiege Wei to save Zhao. This is not from Art of War. My one of my viewers point that out. My viewers are, some of them really smart. I'm learning from
Oh
them
yeah.
a lot. It's actually from a book called The 36 Strategies, which I believe is written in the Ming Dynasty, much, much later than the
Oh.
Art of War. The Art of War was written, warrior state time, which is 2,500 years ago.
Mm.
Now, it's a common mistake. When
Mm.
I was looking it up, it's a common mistake that people mixed things with the Art of War. Like you said, it's widely cited and quoted and etc. So
Mm.
after the Art of War was written, there were throughout the Chinese history, there are plenty of military books written, but probably with no exception, every one of them is more or less influenced by the Art of War. And
Oh
so
yes.
they quote that, they got cited that, and so that's why people mix it with some famous tactics and all the time. So I'm making the mistake that many people are
Mm.
making, just so to correct that.
Well, I mean, what one would say is that one is very grateful to one's viewers that they're alert and aware of these things. I mean, it shows that erudite people want to listen to our programs, which is actually I find that very flattering. Whenever I'm corrected in that kind of way,
Yeah,
which I often am, by the way,
yeah.
very often am, I find that it makes me feel better
Hmm.
actually
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it shows that people take if people who know their literature
Uh-huh.
take
Right.
what we say seriously. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
very interesting, actually.
yeah.
And by the way, one of the most interesting facts that I remember discovering about quite a long time ago was that up to about 1800, in any one year, about three-quarters of the things that were published anywhere in the world were published in China. I mean,
Yeah.
just how it gives you some idea of this. And on every conceivable topic, um, I'm as you probably know, my background of my original topic was history, and one of the most interesting facts for me is the exceptionally high standard of Chinese historical literature,
Yeah.
going all the way back to the beginning. The was it the historian, the famous historian who wrote about the Qin and the Han. I can't remember his name, but I'm sure you know whom I mean. Yes,
Sima Qian. Yeah, yeah.
Sima Qian. That's right.
Huh?
So I mean, Chinese. The Chinese understand had a scientific approach to history long before anybody in the West did. And it's apparently true in literary criticism. My wife is a teacher of literature in English, but I mean she was she's seen some Ming Dynasty literary criticism, and she said, "My goodness, I mean
Yeah.
the quality of what they were doing is 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 astonishing. There's nothing like that in the West at that time, and I'm pretty sure the same is true about military studies. That
Mm.
the Chinese are far ahead in that respect. And as you correctly said, I'm sure the art of war is the foundational
Oh, yeah.
treatise. Yeah,
Yeah. And that's part of it. Now, for one thing, China invented paper. So I think that plays a big role because you can preserve a lot of this history that way, relatively cheap and easy. So I think
Mhm.
that part of it. But what's interesting to me is that the throughout the dynasty, different dynasties, they always have an official that entirely responsibility is to write down history. They have an
Yeah,
official dedicated person would be
yes.
participating in all the meetings, discussions, and the whole purpose for that person is to write them down. I find
Yeah.
that's very interesting.
Oh, it's astonishing. I mean, of course, they also invented printing,
Uh-huh, yeah,
which
printing, yeah.
is
Mhm.
which is
Yeah,
as and they were doing it long hundreds of years before
yeah. Hmm.
anyone in the West even thought about doing anything like that. But you're absolutely right. The dynastic histories, which are the source the source for Chinese history, are astonishing. They are very very remarkable,
Yeah. Now
and
you,
they're very intelligently organized as well. They're not just simple narratives.
Yeah, and you can see they are the emperors does that. All the emperors does that. That's very interesting. Now you can say they do it for self-serving purpose because they want to learn the mistakes from previous dynasties,
Yeah.
right? Previous emperors. But in the long run, it does educate every generation's leaders. That's pretty much
Yes.
what they did.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the way it worked, and again, because this is my original intended trade. It was even more remarkable because what happened apparently was that at the start of every new dynasty, they would start the historian would start compiling the history, and the
Hmm.
massive amount of records would be put together. The emperor himself was not allowed to interfere with this
Hmm.
work,
Yeah.
so
Hmm.
it was all done,
Yeah.
and it continued right through the
Mm.
dynasty. Then
Yeah.
when the dynasty ended, the job of the succeeding dynasty would be to edit this material and to publish it,
Yeah.
and then start, and at the same time start its own history. So it was intended to be a chronicle for the Chinese people, but
Hmm.
not just, but at an incredibly sophisticated level. It means that you know exactly what was going on in China, at the court level, at the central government level, and the policies that were
Yeah.
being carried out, and the discussions, with a degree of accuracy that you will never find in terms of any other state. And it's supplemented from the Ming Dynasty onwards by a huge number of local histories that were produced in various regions around China. The quality of the historical records in China is just off the scale,
Mm.
and no Western state has anything on that of that standard, and of course, only a fraction of them have been read or understood in the West. I'm sure in China it's much more advanced.
Yeah. And also, they complemented that. They have the
Yeah,
historical record, but then also, the kings, the queens, they all get buried. And so
yeah,
the tombs, the archaeologists, the when the tombs are discovered,
yeah.
then they would discover some evidence of the history
Yes,
books. So they
yes.
kind of
Well,
complement each other, right? So,
that's right. They do. They do. And this is the extraordinary thing. They corroborate each other.
mhm, yeah.
I mean, which is very, very unusual.
Uh-huh.
But because usually, when people, you read the history and then you do the archaeology, and
Uh-huh.
sometimes the archaeology contradicts the history.
Yeah.
That doesn't tend to happen in
Mhm.
China. In
Yeah.
China, it's quite otherwise, because the great difference was that the state, not the emperor, but the
Mhm.
Chinese
Thanks.
state was responsible for the history,
Yeah.
and maintained very, very high standards
Yeah.
in preparing it.
Yeah, the thing you talk about, the Sima Qian's most famous book, 《史记》, the history
Yeah.
book, was when they discovered the terracotta warriors in Xi'an,
The
right?
army, yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
the
Yeah.
army there. Lots of things he was written in his book was confirmed from
Oh,
the
absolutely, yes.
tomb. Yeah, so
Absolutely, yes.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
And the art of war in general is more philosophical. And then there's 36 strategies, even though it's called the strategies, it's more tactical, just so you
Yeah.
know. And speaking of strategy, so let's talk about this nuclear strategy, Biden's nuclear strategy
Mm.
that you brought up last time. My understanding, this thing, I think it's called the nuclear employment guidance. I think that's what it's called.
Mm.
I assume it is created during the Cold War. It was supposed to update every 4 years, and that's what Biden did. Now, I don't get much information out of it because it's highly secretive. It's very
Mm.
confidential. And so the only thing that I find out is that it seems like they put in China, North Korea in there, not just Russia. Um,
Mm.
so can you tell me more what your whole take of that whole thing?
You're absolutely correct. I mean, this is a very, very highly classified document. It's essentially a strategy paper, a military strategy paper. Is primarily for the military. It is not the same, for example, as I mean, the Russians have a nuclear use doctrine, for example, which has the force of law in Russia. It's also updated, but what that does is it sets out the conditions in which nuclear weapons can be used. This isn't about that. This basically says, look, we got nuclear weapons. Who are our enemies? Who are we preparing to counter with our nuclear weapons? It's a philosophically very, very different thing. Now, you're quite right. It is a concept that originated during the Cold War, and I don't know exactly when. My guess is probably in the 1960s. That would be a reasonable time frame for expecting something like this to begin. And you're quite right, it's updated every 4 years. Now, the historic adversary, nuclear adversary of the United States, was the Soviet Union. And, its war fighting, nuclear war fighting strategy would have been focused on the Soviet Union. And then after the Soviet Union fell, Russia inherited the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, and it continues to be the most powerful nuclear state in terms of nuclear weapons. And until very recently, the United States primarily focused on thinking about Russia as its adversary. Now, what seems to have happened is that they widened the scope of this thing, and they're now treating China as a potential adversary in a nuclear war in the same way that they're treating Russia, or have for a very long time treated Russia as a potential adversary in a nuclear war. And they're doing the same with North Korea. Now, China, Russia, and North Korea all have nuclear weapons, and they all have intercontinental ballistic missiles with a capability to reach the United States. All of this, the product, let's never forget, of American policy. I mean, China
Yeah.
did not have a powerful nuclear weapons capability until very recently because it didn't want one. North Korea didn't either. They only started to develop theirs in earnest after after the millennium, as it turns out, much later than many people assume. And as for the Soviets, it's a little known fact that after nuclear weapons were first used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviets proposed to the United States that nuclear weapons should not be the monopoly of any one power, that they
Mhm.
be brought under control of an international agency, and that the United States, in effect, should surrender exclusive control of them, an idea which the US refused. And as we know, it very quickly uh, um, went into a Cold War situation with the Soviets. So, what is happening is that the United States is collecting enemies and it is threatening those enemies. It started firstly with the Soviets in the 40s and 50s. And for a long time, that created a kind of
Mhm.
bipolar tension. But now it's collecting more enemies even faster. It's now treating China, which is not a country that wants to be an enemy of the United States, but it's increasingly treating it as an enemy. It's made an enemy of North Korea, which made very hard efforts. It's a fact, we could think whatever you like about the North Korean regime, but anyway, they did make serious efforts in the 90s and the 2000s to come to terms with the US. They found it impossible. It's the old story. The US promises one thing, does something different. And the result is that all of these countries have now acquired these capabilities,
Mhm.
ultimately to defend themselves in the United States. The United States doesn't sit back, ask itself, was that right? Did we do something wrong? Have we brought all of these threats into existence against ourselves? No, not at all. They see themselves as the injured party. They're now preparing to fight everybody, everywhere, all the time. It is both a sign of the failure of previous US policy and of the bankruptcy of existing policy and of the very dangerous threat environment that the United States is creating.
Yeah, I don't know if you read the Oppenheimer or watched the movie. One thing pretty interesting is that Oppenheimer actually is the one. Now he went along to build the nuclear bomb because Germany was building one, so he thought U.S. needs one. But one is about hydrogen bomb, which is much more powerful. He was against it. And he said, because if we made one, the Soviet will make one too.
Yes.
And so it will be, before you know it, it will be quickly out of control. It will be way too dangerous to all of us, right? I think he's correct. And that's exactly what happened.
Mm.
But instead of listen to him, okay, saying, let's just not do this, he was being, because he said that, he was being regarded as somehow pro-Soviet, right? And like
Yeah.
you're saying something helping the Soviet. He's doing that. He's saying that for to benefit U.S., right? This is not benefiting us when you do this. When Soviet has hydrogen power, how can that be good for the United States? But for that, he was even taken away his security
Yes.
clearance and etc. So I find that's remarkable that now they don't seem to reflect that at all. Oppenheimer as a movie, it came out not that long ago. They don't watch that. They don't think about it.
No, they don't think about it. In fact, I mean, a personality like Oppenheimer would find himself in exactly the same position today as Oppenheimer did in the 50s. A couple of weeks ago on the Duran, we interviewed Theodore Postel, who's, of course, a rocket scientist. And he is involved in weapons development. And he was telling the US authorities he's working with the Pentagon, he was working inside the Pentagon. And he was saying, some of these things that we're doing incredibly dangerous. They might have all kinds of consequences. We need to talk to the Russians about this because it's all at that time focused against the Russians. Let's see whether we can agree and even share technology with them. So, of
Mhm.
course, he had all his passes taken from him. He found himself isolated. He wasn't listened to. And, of course, the threat environment has deteriorated in exactly the way that he said it would. So it's exactly the same story. And Parstal was saying how dangerous the situation has now become because not only is the political environment in the United States very bad now, but the scientific community has become very intimidated and very corrupted.
Mhm.
And rather than act as a brake in the way that Oppenheimer tried to provide a brake and Postel tried to provide a brake, they are facilitating these policies.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, US always have smart people, sane people, but they are not listened to. See, that's the
No.
frustrating part. It's not like
Mm.
nobody warning you, nobody reminding you. There are plenty of people, who are
Yeah.
saying the right thing, doing the right thing, but they got sidelined, right? They even got prosecuted and punished for expressing themselves. Okay.